I'm coming along to the Sunday markets now. I'm dressed now. My security blanket. And these are the actual markets across here. Should go and have a look at. Here we are. We want the liquor bond.
You bet.
We've got Trent Christain back again.
Nibbling on sponge cake, watching the sun bake. All of those tourists are covered in oil. Well, we don't really need it today, do we, Di? Not hot enough, eh? Strumming my 6-string on my front porch swing. Smell those shrimps, they're beginning to boil. Oh, yeah.
It's time for me to go. These will be go. The rain's getting coming.
Let me tell you a story.
What to wear. So what to wear, Yoli? Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to this amazing presentation that we're all...
A hilly bar. Try and get lunch here.
It's a really nice, we don't receive presentations and information on this particular aspect of our history. And then after Helen's presentation, I'm going to talk on the stories of the Sirius. So Helen Bracken, I should introduce Helen properly. Helen and I are actually very lucky because we're actually both former managers of the museum down in Kingston. So we've been able to work in one of the best jobs on the island, and to now have the opportunity to present it to you during this week, which is it's fun for us. We might be a bit rusty. Here comes our sound man. So I told them that notice when you walk in that they are actually...
Yes, I did have the wonderful job of managing the museums here. It was a dream job. And before that, I seemed to only get to work at commissariat stores, so I seemed to always be surrounded by food. So that's why I thought today I would focus on this. All right. I'm going to start, give you a bit of a background. So the Polynesian settlement, we think they came here between 1300 and 1500 AD, but you will hear lots of different dates for when they were here because we don't know that much about them. What we do know about them is what they used to eat. So this fits in quite well with my talk today. So we believe they journeyed from New Zealand to New Zealand via the Kermadec Islands, where before I was leaving there was quite an exciting project about to start where we were able to zap stones to work out exactly where the Polynesians had come from. So I don't know if that's still going on, but we'll have, hopefully next time I talk to you, I'll know a bit more about it. Roots of the hibiscus, flower stem or spadix of the Norfolk Island palm, later known as the cabbage palm, which incidentally your ancestors also ate. The Jew's ear and poo, which are both edible fungi and fruit of the pepper tree. When the first Europeans did arrive in 1788, they did find west of Mount Pitt, around the Cascade area, which became known as Charlottesville, stone axes, drizzles and other tools, and there was also other remnants like the canoe that Philip Kidley King found, bananas, the Polynesian rat, which is quite cute, they've got a little rounded ear instead of the rattus, which has the straight one. And they found that it was a seasonal destination for many of the seabirds, so it's been noted in Kingston quite a bit. They don't know why the Polynesians left. They think that it might have been a food shortage because, as you know, the Polynesian settlers migrated right through the Pacific, but they thought maybe the El Nino may have made conditions not so good. They didn't have freighter planes like we do now, and they didn't have ships like we do. So they think that might have been part of the problem. But now we'll get on to why you're here. Norfolk Island was going to be the breadbasket of the Port Jackson settlement. As you know, I won't go into the history because you already know this and you've heard it ad nauseum all week, but it was found by Captain Cook in 1774, and he thought it was going to be this little oasis in the Pacific that could help to support the settlement in Sydney. There were many challenges, but within a week of arriving, Philip Kidley King had started organising the planting of crops, and a patch of land was cleared close to the beach with typical English vegetables. They grew potatoes, turnips, onions, spinach, which is cabbage, as well as some barley and wheat. You can see here, being military, he kept excellent records. So I was able to find his diary, and he listed it out in exacting detail. There were challenges, but the difficulties were soon overcome, and the settlement grew and a large variety of plants and stock were introduced. After the initial crops were planted, King extended back into the bush and opened up Arthur's Vale, which I'm sure you've driven through quite a few times by now. Coming down Taylor's Road to get to Emily Bay, that bit of land on the right is Arthur's Vale. The dense vegetation that met Philip Kidley King and the settlers was quickly felled and provided excellent fodder for the pigs and goats, which started to thrive in excellent numbers around the island. In 1795, David Collins, any descendants of David Collins here? No? Wrote, swine were increasing so rapidly on Phillip Island, they took them over to Phillip Island too, on Phillip Island, now stocked by the government, that Mr. King thought he should be able to issue fresh pork during 4 days of the week. The number of persons on the island around that time was 495. Now, the reason I say that is because I want to show you exactly what they ate and what their rations were. So I've had to go with the Sydney rations because I couldn't find the exact Norfolk rations, not being able to get off the island at the moment and time being a factor. I know, slack. But here we go. So I was going to carry the microphone around, but I'll put it on the table and you read the list. Right. Now, the way I worked out how much this was is I went into my freezer and I got some beef out for dinner, and 7 pounds is about 3.5 kilos. So, which fit into this sack like this. So this is per week. This is the amount of beef. This is each and per week, okay? But this is 1788. I'm going to get to the Sirius in a minute. This is the amount of bread/flour. I don't know why they said bread/flour, but I'm guessing it was what was available at the time. I better get another 7 pounds. Butter, which was, hang on. Sorry, there you go. Butter, 6 ounces, which is about 150 grams. Pork. So it's about that much pork per week, which is about 2 kilos. Flour. So it was £7 again, 3.5 kilos worth of flour. And yes, that is my flour from home. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. So I'm reading the wrong ones. Rice. How much was rice? Half a pound, 250 grams. And then peas. So peas were 3 pints, which is about 1.5 litres. So that was their weekly ration that was distributed from the commissary or the commissariat. Okay? They had all the vegetables that they were able to grow, so they had Saturday afternoons off so they could tend their gardens. So that boosted up their food supplies, but it's not too bad. That looks about like what I would buy for a week. So, you know, they weren't starving in 1788. And just so you know, that was the male ration. Women received 2/3 of that amount. So that's for one person. That's for one person. One person per week. So if you were married, you got that plus, if you're a man, and that plus 2/3 for your wife. And then you have the vegetables on top of it. Okay? So what else did they eat? They ate what they could get, basically. Just after landing on Norfolk in 1788, King saw 4 turtles basking themselves on a sandy beach which lies at the eastern side of the bay, so Emily Bay, close under Point Hunter. I immediately went away with some people and turned with 2 of them, and I brought the nets and they caught the turtles. They ate the turtles. There was also the dreaded salt beef. And the ship biscuits. So I couldn't make dreaded salt beef because I'm about to show you, oh no, it's here. If you can read that, that's the recipe for making salted beef. It is not the most appetising of things to eat, and they had it in abundance. I thought ship's biscuits might be a bit more palatable, and it's something I could cook yesterday. No. So I hope none of you cracked your teeth. But they get those, and in the recipe that I found from the British Museum, they said that people would soak, so these biscuits were designed to last months, sometimes years they'd last for. They would have to soak them in the soup or the broth or the stew for 10 to 15 minutes so that they wouldn't crack their teeth. They were that hard. So mine weren't that bad, despite what my husband says about my cooking. So there was the salted beef, the ship's biscuits, and yep, you can see the recipe for the salted beef. They used approximately 2 ounces of salt per each pound of meat, which is a lot of salt. A lot of salt. The recipe actually kind of makes it sound not too bad, but people just dreaded. You can imagine, putting it into perspective, you're already on a boat the size of a Sydney Harbour ferry with people that you don't particularly want to be with. You're coming out, if you're a convict, against your will, and then they make you eat this. So it really wasn't a pleasant time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I saw saltpetre there. That's a component of gunpowder, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct. Very useful item.
The good thing about doing these presentations is you guys probably know more about some things than I do, so I actually learn a lot from talking to you.
Up here, saltpetre. Well, saltpetre.
Alright, now there are quite a few recipe books, but the most interesting one is Mrs. Cook's recipe book. So she was the wife of Captain James Cook. It was published almost 100 years after she had passed, and she lived until she was 94. So she almost reached 100. But within her recipe book, and I'll bring it up in a minute, are a number of interesting recipes which she had gathered together talking to Joseph Banks and other notable people who sailed with her husband. So she tried to make it so that any meat that they could find was at least palatable. Okay? And here's two that I thought were great. Alright. So you've got stewed rats. I like that, you first got to catch it. And she went down into minute detail of how to butcher the animals to get the best cut of meat from the animal. Okay.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so I'll let you have a read of that. So the turtle soup I thought was interesting. It would have been one of the recipes utilised by Philip Gidley King when he caught those 4 turtles back in 1788. And the turtle soup actually doesn't sound too bad, but yeah, I don't know that I'd be dining on rats. Yeah. So I'll let you keep reading while I get to the challenges that were faced. Yeah. No. So the gentleman just asked, did the ratters come with the Polynesians? No, they were ship's rats. So they only came with the Europeans. The Polynesians brought their own version, which is the Polynesian rats. When I first moved to the island, I thought I'd seen a rabbit, which is impossible. There are no rabbits on Norfolk anymore, because there was this animal. It was like a little baby rabbit. If I had been back in Queensland, I would have swore it was a rabbit, but it wasn't. It was a little Polynesian rat. So yes, I went and asked at the Flora and Fauna Society. So yeah, the Polynesians brought the Polynesian rat, and the Europeans brought rattus, which is a bit of a scourge at the moment in terms of the seabirds. Conditions. If some of you were here last week or the week before, you will have seen how windy and wet it can get here. The first gardens that were located near the beach were actually wrecked by the wind. So there were many times coming out of the museum, I just got a free blow dry. There was no point doing my hair at all because it just ended up all over the place. The wind down there is something else. The vegetables and grain stores were attacked by rats. The army grub, which is still a scourge here, and it's a scourge over in Australia as well. Queensland has it quite bad at the moment. Philip Gidley King sent all the women with staves to beat the ground where 1 acre of wheat is quite close to the earth. An astonishing number of killed, but in 2 hours the caterpillars were as numerous as ever. So that was one of the jobs that the women had, was to squish all all the caterpillars. The parrots, which now it's exciting to see a green parrot, and we have quite a few out at my place. The grubs disappeared, but then the parrots came in. And King whinges that they were plagued with ear parakeets, which destroy a quantity of the seeds. And then we come to the Sirius, which, well, you've heard all about that in your visit to the Sirius Museum, so I won't go into the sinking yet, but it did nearly cause the abandonment of both settlements. Right, so 1790, the Sirius wrecks. When I used to do the tour down at the museum, I said people really haven't changed in 200 years. If you're in a management position, you're always going to tell your superiors the positives of what's going on in your venture rather than the negatives. So King was sending over very positive reports, and Sydney was in trouble. So they sent, long story cut short, they sent the people over the Sirius wrecks. The population increases to 500 people. There was no quick solution evident, because you will have heard how long it took to get from England to here. Even China, any of the northern islands, they were out of reach now. So to get the number of stores that were required. So for the 2 days after the Sirius wrecked, the Sirius's crew and everyone on the island was successful in getting most of the provisions ashore. Every item which came ashore was placed in the care of sentinels until claimed by the owner, if it was a private property, or put into the public stores. And on the 10th of April 1790, a stock take was held on the provisions which had been saved. So they had 12,249 kilos of flour, 5,215 kilos of rice, 47 bushels of chickpeas, 3,798 kilos of beef, about the same of pork, and most importantly, 2,500 litres of spirits. In response to the sinking, martial law was imposed by Major Ross, who, amongst other things, makes plundering of the public stores a capital crime. Numerous convicts were convicted of stealing and were unfortunately hung. And now we come to, so you've seen how much food they had in 1788. This is how much out of the commissary people got after the Sirius sank. So that mental picture. Flour. And check out of pork. So you can see the difference. Sorry, I was going to try and take this off, it take too long. So this is 1788, this is 1790. Which arrived just after the Sirius had sunk. They, in the diaries, oh sorry, I missed a bit. Okay, so an entry from Ralph Clark. Do we have any descendants from Ralph Clark here? No? Okay. His diary states that on Tuesday the 20th, there was fine weather and very little surf. So they sent a boat out to try and catch fish, but they only caught 10. If any of you have been on island and fished from the shore, you'll know that it's incredibly difficult to catch fish here, at least I find it difficult. But you go out in a boat and your arms get sore from bringing so many in. But they only caught 10. A non-commissioned officer and 4 privates emptied the boat, and the storekeeper ordered the Lieutenant Governor and Council to stop half a pound of meat out of every 7, as every man has only at present 3.5 pounds of meat a week, and in the room of the said half pound of meat, everyone will get a great abundance of birds. Okay. So, The diaries say that the birds had a strong fishy taste, but our keen appetites relished them very well. The eggs were excellent. So you can imagine when you're only getting that from stores, you're going to enjoy whatever you can get. When you're hungry, everything tastes good. Lessons learned. So, you know, if life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. An abundance of the Providence petrel and the fertile soil prompted Major Ross to suggest that soldiers become independent of the public store. Ross formed small groups of convicts and allotted sections of cleared land and allowed extra leisure time for the cultivation of crops and provided a sow per group. In his general order of 8th of January 1791, Ross said it is expected that the convicts who are indulged, and this is his words, are indulged with the privilege of maintaining themselves shall be classed together and not less than 3 in a family, women and children included. As for the further encouragement of such male convicts, such females should not be called upon by the public to do any work except for the hoeing the corn upon the appearance of rain, or picking the caterpillars or grub from the corn, or any other work that's evident. So it was the ladies' work to ensure that the crops were maintained. Unfortunately, many of those included in the scheme were inept at farming and were largely ill-fed with widespread discontent. So it's similar to the soldier settlements that happened after World War I. You know, you give city slickers an acre of land in an area without any education, it's very hard to grow crops. So discontent started to be sown. King saw this once he'd returned and instated his own land grant system, and this map here, which you would have seen maybe at the REO or down at the museums, shows all the different lots that were taken up by people across the island. While this happened under King, in 1800, Favreau received conditions of land grants documents, and every eligible male was granted 6 hectares with 2 extra hectares if he were married. An additional hectare was given to every child at the time of settling, and settlers were provided with tools and seeds and rations for 18 months under certain circumstances, and assigned servants. So apples, lemon, coffee, they were all successfully grown, and they still grow on the island. And King reported in 1794 that there was 706 cubic metres of maize to spare, so he was able to start trading it. The late 1790s saw failed wheat crops, but other agricultural crops were still successful, meaning that Norfolk not only became the breadbasket, which was meant to become in 1788, for the mainland colonies, but it also commenced trading with whaling ships which were coming past. They worked out the massive number of whales that were migrating south, and the whaling ships followed. And there are also commercial ships coming through. They traded livestock and provisions such as salted pork, grain, fresh fruit and vegetables. When the closing of the settlement started, was first proposed, suggestions were made for free settlers to stay and continue the successful farming and trading practices. But sadly this wasn't agreed. Otherwise, you might still have your land. For everyone who's here, have you seen where your family had their lots yet? Yeah. You've gone out and driven to where their house would have been and their farms might have been?
Where do you get that information from?
From the research centre, and you can go down and get the map down at the REO, and then just have a look at the general road map to see where you can go and see. A lot of it is on private land, so don't go traipsing through people's properties, but it is interesting to see where your ancestors might have lived.
So all those white pigs I brought over to Jamie would be no use for that.
Okay. So when it was first, it was decided against to let the settlers stay here. Most stock was slaughtered and salted, except for some wild pigs and goats that couldn't be caught. Dogs were left to deal with them, but they really didn't do a good job, because 11 years after everyone had left here and the second settlement started, Captain Turton, who had arrived to set up the penal settlement in 1825, wrote in his diary that wild goats are numerous and pigs beyond all calculations. So I don't know what the dogs did, but it certainly wasn't eat the pigs and goats. Right, and the second settlement, and this is just to give context to the first settlement, it was established in response to a perceived need for a place of the extremist punishment short of death, which would deal with the male reoffenders from Australia. On arrival, like I said, there were numerous goats and pigs running around, but they also had the leftover overgrown gardens, so the slash and burn that happened didn't happen all across the island. There were still orchards in existence. We've got a very old bush lemon tree in our backyard that's still fruiting, and the pawpaw. So you might have tried the pawpaw jelly. That came over with the first settlement. Okay. So the overgrown gardens, wild orchards, the pigs and goats, and before long, this meant that they could set up the settlement and had fields of cultivation, a granary, watermill and windmills. And the settlement at Longridge, which where the stables are now, over at Bumboris, up that end of the island, that's where the agricultural station was. There were large grain silos established in 1839, and they are still located in the hills above Kingston, but they are on private land, so don't go wandering through looking for them. But they enable the storage of grain. And then I was going to talk about the Pitcairn food, but I won't, because you heard all about it this morning, and I heard that you got lovely food cooked by Rachel, which makes my ship's biscuit look a bit dodgy and a bit povo, doesn't it? So, but food is an important part of the Norfolk culture, and this is a photo from the salt collection down at the Museum of Bounty Day, and it really does look like that. On Bounty Day, you go down to the compound, and there's just miles of food, and no one's allowed to eat until Grace is sung. And I've had a few of you comment about how good the kids are here on the island, and they really are. My first Bounty Day, I was sitting and the kids were playing football in the middle of where all the tables were, and as one of the grandmas got up and said, "Right, you lot sit down, that we're about to sing Grace," and as one, they sat. And they stopped, and then as soon as Grace was sung, they got up and kept playing football. So, but it's a very important part of the Pitcairn culture. Alright, so that's it from me. Sorry again about the...
Okay, do you need a second to stretch your legs, or you're okay if we keep plowing through? Keep going through? Okay, great. I'm going to, as you can see from the top of the slide here, I'm going to focus in on stories from HMS Sirius, the flagship of our first fleet. To me, Norfolk Island's role in the earliest years of British settlement is incredibly important, and it's also incredibly, I think, under-recognised. So it's my hope that by the end of this afternoon's session, together with the time you spend at the museum and wandering around Kingston, that you'll be charged with the need to return home and tell all and sundry about this big story that's going to come from our little island, because it's incredibly important, and it's just not really well known and recognised. And to me, the jewel in the crown of our settlement story on Norfolk is the Sirius and her artefacts, and the only material culture that there is from the First Fleet. As the First Fleet's flagship, the Sirius was the biggest ship of the fleet, and of course it carried Captain Arthur Phillip, the Commodore of the fleet, and the man who was to be the first governor of the new colony. Also carried Philip Edward King, who was to become the first commandant here at Norfolk Island. The First Fleet's arrival, with over 1,500 people to begin a new British settlement, brought them quite literally to the other side of the world at a time when journeying and communications back to Mother England meant that in a current context they may as well have just completed a journey to another planet. While the Sirius' story began in a forgery over 240 years ago, in 1780 in the village of Rotherhithe on the River Thames,
This afternoon, I'm going to work backwards in time to focus on some of the other stories, and some of them being the more major stories of her life, her wrecking, her recovery, and display of her artefacts. Why did this bop for me and not for you, Helen? What does it mean? To begin with, I'm just going to travel us back about 11 years ago to the story of the 2012 setting up of the Sirius Museum as you see it today. And I've just lost a page of my notes. I think that's okay. What was that?
Again?
All right. So as I say, I'm going to travel us back to. I just want you to ask you to picture this. We've got an 18th century 1.7 tonne anchor that's hanging mid-air, half in and half out of the gantry door of the pier store, which is the World Heritage listed building right on the edge of Kingston Pier. The anchor head is wider than the door it has to travel through, which is almost a third smaller than the average door size. Added to the drama is the fact that the 5 metre long anchor is a major artefact from Australia's most important shipwreck collection. And following its removal through that historic yet inadequate doorway will be several hundred other objects, including carronades, massive ballast blocks and fragile scientific instruments. The Sirius collection was being to the then Commonwealth Your Community Heritage program, which was matched then 50-50 by the Norfolk Island government in terms of the money that went into it. The grant provided funds to move the collection from the pier store into a dedicated, environmentally suitable museum which was within the Protestant chapel. Improved environmental conditions drove the need to rehouse the collection as they had experienced some deterioration. Complex as well. So damaging the buildings would have been as disastrous as damaging the artefacts themselves. In short, the move could not occur unless both could be assured of the safety. And what you're watching here is that anchor actually being moved out of the small pier store door. The only way that we could actually undertake this activity on Norfolk, all the men that you see there involved except for one are local men. And the skill that they learn in Lightridge, in bringing all our cargo ashore, was the skills that they used to be able to make sure that we could actually get this anchor picked up, 1.7 tonne anchor, and actually moved out of that door. You can see how it took about 3 hours for them weighing it up, moving around, slowly moving, slowly working out how to actually get that anchor out of the door. That footage there I love. That anchor is being driven past the wreck site, where it was actually recovered from. Now we're at the new building. There's a side door. You might, if you came in through the front door, you would see the back door, and this anchor now had to be gently probed into the side door. It was unbelievable, and I tell you what, at the end of, particularly when we pulled it out of the pier store, there was spontaneous applause by all the Norfolk men. It was just incredible. They really worked together. They watched, they signalled, they discussed every single inch of that anchor's movement and progress out the door. Once the anchor made its way into that Protestant chapel, it was actually put down, prepared and put onto the stock. You can see this stock. The stock had to be taken off when the anchor was displayed in the Pier Store Museum because the building was just too small. So it was absolutely fabulous to put the anchor back up onto the stock. That took an awful lot of work, and in fact one of the fellows that you see involved in the move was the original fellow who Franklin, who actually was involved in making that stock when this anchor came ashore. It's him walking out of the door there now. Of course, opening a museum that's dedicated to the Sirius created a wonderful opportunity for the museum to tell the story of the First Fleet journey, celebrate Norfolk's role in the earliest settlement of the nation, and also commemorate the people of the First Fleet. It's also fitting to have a museum dedicated to her artefacts, as in a sense, I really feel like the Sirius is our Mayflower. She led the fleet of 11 ships filled with people who were to begin a new colony and life far, far away from Mother England. So, that's you can see that. It's interesting. artefacts actually come up off the seafloor and be available for us to display? And the answer to that takes us back to the mid-1980s, in the lead up to the 1988 bicentenary of Australia. I think the story of the recovery of the artefacts is not only a story of the incredible bravery of the divers, but also it's been described by Jane Collins in her book A Guide to the Sirius Maritime Collection as one of the most successful maritime archaeology projects completed in Australian waters. The project was put together as considered to be a fabulous undertaking to actually celebrate the bicentenary in 1988. What better way to try and celebrate the bicentenary? The surf line that breaks on the reef are an important and, as I've said before, brave story in themselves and worthy of a deep respect. Take a walk out to the Sirius Monument on the waterfront and look out to where the surfers are surfing, right on the edge of the outer reef there. And it's right there, right underneath that surf zone, that the divers had to work. The first expedition occurred in December 1983, and it was to undertake a brief preliminary survey and archaeological examination of the site. Bad weather. This was not just a, send some ships out with people that we don't want to have come back again. Personnel from the Western Australian Maritime Museum have not only been responsible for the recovery of the objects, but also their immediate conservation on island. Some of the major items, including the anchor raised in 1985, and the 2 carronades, were taken to Western Australia for treatment, and then they were brought back. Over the past 30 years, as objects returned back here, the then Norfolk Island government assumed responsibility for their care. However, the first Sirius anchor to be recovered was deliberately blasted from the reef in 1905. It had been visible at low tide. The top of the shank would be visible. And New South Wales politician Sir Francis Sutter had requested it be retrieved and shipped to Sydney to be placed alongside Arthur Phillip's statue in the Botanical Gardens. However, when the anchor finally arrived in Sydney, it had both its flukes missing, so those end bits, and it didn't look quite as imposing or attractive as Sir Sutter expected, so he had it positioned in Macquarie Place instead, and that's where it still stands today. That's him, that's Sir Sutter. The anchor had been blasted off from the ocean floor by a number of Norfolk Islanders from the Methodist Church. The administrator at the time provided the explosives, and the men carried out the exercise with the promise of a £20 reward. And they were reminded when they began that journey of that job of their financial obligations to the Methodist Church in Sydney to encourage their involvement in the exercise. This one lovely report from the time describes the sequence of events, and it says, the administrator provided the explosives and 8 men went out at low tide and tried to blast away the rock. These men were Cornish Quintal, Tilly Adams, who was a diver, Marsh Adams, Fish Adams, Eustace Christian, Johnny Jackson, Dan Buffett and Nicholas Quintal. They reported that they were unable to raise the anchor. That night, a prayer meeting was held and the anchor was landed on the pier by 10 o'clock the next morning. £20 was paid. And that's it when it was opened in Macquarie Place. Okay, I'm just going to go a little bit back out of sequence in our timeline, heading back to 1780 and that shipbuilding village of Rotherhithe where the Sirius was built. So she was constructed as a Baltic trader in 1780. She was purchased by the Admiralty in 1781 and she's fitted out as a store ship. She made several voyages to North America during the latter part of the American War of Independence. Admiralty plans for the Sirius after purchasing her. The technical drawings of the ship were prepared. These show her to be a deep, roomy vessel with good cargo carrying capacity, also flat-bottomed so that she could be easily careened and repaired. Refitted at a cost of £7,000, she was then renamed the Sirius and then rated as a sixth rated armed vessel of more than 500 tonne with 20 guns and a crew of 160. Her purpose, of course, was to lead the first fleet to Sydney. New South Wales, I should say. skating along very quickly, our First Fleet voyage. You're all very familiar with this, 1787 to 1788. She made that First Fleet voyage to New South Wales via Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town, and finally Botany Bay. And it's good to just focus in a little bit on some of the beautiful art and the people of that journey. On board, of course, was Captain Arthur Phillip. This is the circa 1788 engraved plate that appeared in Phillip's account of the First Fleet voyage and settlement at Port Jackson. So Phillip was appointed the first governor of New South Wales and was the original commander of the ship. He was, of course, the one who ordered Philip Gidley King to Norfolk Island in 1788 and ordered the Sirius and Supply to Norfolk in 1790. Also on board was Captain John Hunter, Philip's second in command on the Sirius during the voyage to New South Wales, and he was the man who then took over the command of the Sirius. We've got some beautiful paintings of the First Fleet. This one's by George Raper, and it's of the entrance of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil from the anchorage, and it's signed Geo.Raper 1790. This view shows all the 11 ships of the First Fleet anchored outside the entrance of Guanabara Bay, which is the harbour of Rio de Janeiro, on the 6th of August 1787. It's a moving image of the First Fleet clustered together on their perilous voyage, really, and they're gathered around as the Sirius is actually there in the centre. It's a reminder that the Sirius was a rated warship and therefore the protector of the fleet. George Raper, the artist, is important to the Sirius story. Only in his late teens on the voyage out, he was a talented artist, and he's stayed on Norfolk throughout 1790 and returned to England on the Wax Simond, arriving in 1792, where he was promoted to lieutenant in 1793. He died in 1797, having risen to be commander of the HMS Expedition. William Bradley, of course, is also on board, and we have some beautiful artwork that he has produced. This one again produced in it says 1787, that's the date it's there, but I think it's from 1790 that he's actually done the painting. And I popped this one in because this is, of course, the arrival into the landscape looks a little different because we've come into the heads. Painted a lot later than there's a modern painting by John Olcott of the First Fleet arriving into the heads. This one is again by George Raper, and it's of the two ships, the two main ships, His Majesty's Brig the Supplies, it's called, His Majesty's Brig the Supplies 1790 off Lord Howe Island, February 1788, and His Majesty's ship Sirius in Sydney Cove 1789. You can see them there side by side. Raper's study of the supply in the Sirius, showing Sirius for the size that she was, as I've already said, 540-ton gun deck. As against the Sirius, she's an armed tender. She's only 170 tonne. She's got eight guns and carries 50 men. The Sirius carried 160, so you're getting that good comparison. Of course, as the tender, she's the small ship. She does all the messaging in between, going backwards and forwards amongst the fleet. Just to underscore the importance of those two ships to the settlement and to the new colony, because we've got 11 ships of the First Fleet, 9 of them are privately owned. And to talk kind of in a shorthand, most of those ships have been allowed, and the owners have approved for them to be on that First Fleet voyage, with the promise that once they get to their destination that they can offload the stores and the convicts and make their way back home to then make more money bringing back the Second Fleet. So it's these two ships that all of our people, all of your descendants, your ancestors, beg your pardon, just depended on for their livelihood once those other ships had left. We have the Sirius and we have the Supply only for the Sydney and the Norfolk Island colony. Almost from their arrival in January 1788, even though Helen has shown us how much food was planned for each person, Governor Phillip knew they were going to be short on food, so he actually sends the Sirius on a voyage circumnavigating the world again to obtain stores of provisions to Cape Town. So she does that voyage. And on her return in 1789, she's careened for extensive repairs in Sirius Cove on the north shore of Sydney Harbour. I'm sure you all know where in Mossman Bay she was careened. However, by the end of 1789, without the arrival of the Second Fleet bringing any further supplies, the Sydney settlement is starving. The plan was to send the Sirius onto the Chinese port of Canton to obtain food and also hardware supplies. I think they, all the picks and the hoes and the shovels that they need, they had possibly underestimated the damage to that kind of equipment in the hard sort of limited soils that they were encountering in Sydney, as opposed to the more fertile and deep soils that they would have been used to using those pieces of equipment on back in England. To relieve the pressure, 275 people, that was made up of 116 men, 67 convict women, 27 children and 65 Marines with some food were to be transferred to Norfolk Island. They set sail at the end of February 1790 in company with HMS Supply. Both ships arrived at Norfolk Island on the 13th of March 1790 through terrible weather. So, and because of the conditions, they actually couldn't anchor couldn't unload and couldn't stay put at Kingston, so they actually went round to the back of the island to Cascade. And at Cascade, they began the laborious task of actually unloading the people. And our lovely Lieutenant Ralph Clark, I love Ralph Clark, and he's on board the Sirius, and he wrote about the landing at Cascade. I never landed in such a bad place in my life. At the best of times, it is a very bad landing, for there is always a great swell around the island, and you are obliged to wait for a smooth time to pull the boat into a rock. And you back the boat in stern foremost, and you're obliged to be very quick to jump out one at a time, and then the boat pulls off to wait for another smooth point, for it is impossible for the boat to lay alongside of the rocks, for should a swell come while the boat is there, it would dash to pieces. So you can imagine these laborious journeys backwards and forwards of pulling the boat in, one or two people jumping off, taking it out, waiting for the next swell to come, pulling it back in, slowly unloading, slowly going backwards and forwards. So it takes, after 3 days of actually slowly getting all of those convicts and some of the Marines ashore, but not the stores and rations to support those people, the weather really worsens to almost gale force, and both of those ships are forced out to sea. Captain John Hunter wrote, "These people were no sooner on shore than the wind shifted to the eastward, and the weather became hazy and blew strong, so that I had no prospect of being able to land any part of the provisions. I knew the exhausted state of stores there, and considerations gave me much anxiety and uneasiness." While the convicts and Marines who had been put ashore made their way by foot from Cascade to Sydney Bay, the Sirius and Supply were both scattered and driven out of sight of the island. What's quite lovely is if you do that drive from Kingston over to Cascade, you basically you drive out of Kingston, you've got the cenotaph on the corner, you keep going straight across the road and you'll head up across the island, you'll come to the intersection where you have the school, just stay on the same road and drive all the way over, keep going, and you'll end up at Cascade Pier. That road is basically on the same lie of land as the track that was there in 1790 that those people walked to get to the Kingston settlement. There was nothing really set up there for them at Cascade, so they had to get themselves to the Kingston settlement. While everybody was landed in, when everybody actually eventually made their way to Kingston, temporary tents had been erected as they were, and then spent a long time just waiting for those two precious ships to actually appear, not knowing what had actually happened to them. You know, they've seen terrible conditions and those ships disappear over the horizon. So you can imagine the anxiety and the sense of fear that they have when they actually, waiting for those ships to arrive. I think the psychology of what's involved in this wrecking event is actually really interesting. And I think standing there on the shore, waiting to see those ships arrive would have been an absolutely devastating thing to do. They would have felt absolutely joyous when finally those two ships appeared. They began, the Sirius, the Supply actually came into, by morning of March 1790, the Supply had completed her unloading. So she came into place, and so she began the journey of, at Kingston, doing the same thing as you do at Cascade, which is putting the longboat down, putting the stores onto that boat. the landing place is it's now on sort of a rocky incline, but there was a little beach just beside where the pier story is at the end of the Kingston pier, and that was the journey that they took in and out to actually unload the stores. So the Sirius comes into place first of all. She's come in from in front of Phillip Island. She's pulled in along the front of Slaughter Bay there. She's unloading her stores. They're doing that journey, and then the Sirius appears. So when they're doing that, of course, they bring their ships into place and they point them with their head out to the wind, into the wind, so facing out to sea. The Supply finishes her unloading, and then the Sirius comes into place and she begins to do her unloading. And she's just got the longboats into the water when Hunter's attention is actually drawn to the fact that the ship is beginning to drift towards the shore. It's actually Captain Ligard Ball, who's on the Supply, who actually raises the alarm and actually alerts Hunter to the fact that the ship is beginning to drift into the shore. The same thing's happening to the Supply. It's beginning to drift as well, but he realises it quicker. He takes his hat off and he madly waves it to get the attention of Captain Hunter, and both the ships sort of immediately take an action to try and head sail windward on a port tack. The Supply is just ahead of the Sirius, so she's a lot smaller and she's a lot more agile, and she's actually able to move a lot more quickly. She actually is able to take a tack and head out to sea in front of the Sirius. However, just at the critical time that they went to sail off and try and avoid. The plan was basically to sail off, make a tack and head out to sea, do a 360-degree turn really, but more further out to sea. But just as they're heading off on that tack, the wind changes direction. And that wind change means that they can't sail directly into the wind, so it meant that the Captain Hunter knew, I think he knew he was doomed at that very point, because it meant that we've got the bay and we have the headland, and the idea was that they would head out that way and come back around. Supply's able to do that. The Sirius, she's coming along. Hunter has to do something, or he's going to actually shipwreck into the cliff on the other, right in front of him. So instead of making his turn out to sea, he makes his turn inland and does turns around, able to turn the ship around. So he's now heading out. If you think of yourself standing at Slaughter Bay, you've got the beach that we're on, you've got Nepean Island, and he's hoping now to sail out between Point Hunter and Nepean Island, which was a very hopeful activity because he's actually, of course, that much further in towards the shore. That wind shift that occurs at that critical time just absolutely spells disaster, and it doesn't take much time for the Sirius to be wrecked. This painting by Bradley actually shows the two ships trying to manoeuvre their way out of the bay against the wind and the tide. So, as I've said, the Supply was able to pass just under the Sirius's weather bow by taking a starboard tack. Doesn't matter what Hunter does, his ship fails to tack and fell off the wind. So the wind and the current were dead against him, and again he desperately tried to change tack, then frantically cut away the anchor, the halyards and the sheets in the hope that they would slow them down. But the wind just blew the ship backwards until, as he describes in his journal, she struck upon a reef of coral rocks which lies parallel to the shore and in a few strokes was bilged. I'm really sorry, all my pages have got out of order, which is very annoying. Okay. What I wanted to do was to... One of the things, I guess, that's really important to understand about these paintings that have been done by Bradley and also by Raper, that are of the circumstances of the wrecking of the Sirius, is that these paintings are almost like the photographs of the day, and they would have certainly, most of them would have been possibly painted, well, they were painted, some in 1790, and then some also probably finished off on that journey back on the Waxima to London, that Hunter had to go back. Of course, he went up for court-martial, because everybody who loses one of Her Majesty's ships has to stand for court-martial. So these paintings would have potentially have been used as the evidence in the trial, and there was quite a lot of coherency between the story of and the story told through the paintings of Bradley, Hunter and Raper of the conditions of what actually happened on the day, which of course absolved Hunter of any wrongdoing. However, we do have a little bit of evidence that maybe contradicts that, as also described by Jacob Nable, who was an able-bodied seaman on board the Sirius. He wrote later about the day that they were having a fine, pleasant day with a light breeze offshore, and all the seamen that could muster hooks and lines were catching gropers, not thinking of any danger. At 12 o'clock, when thinking of going to dinner, Captain Ball of the supply brig hailed us and informed Captain Hunter that we were too close in. Immediately we made sail that we could set. So, it really is what's actually happening here. This actually gives you that journey of the terrible story of what actually happened. So you can see that he tried to really come back on his tack, but it really meant he just had to come in too close to the reef. Today, standing on the waterfront at Slaughter Bay and looking out across the waves, it's not hard to imagine the distress that would have gripped the entire community as they watched this disaster unfold. Amongst them watching on the shore was Norfolk Island's Commandant, Philip King. Watching from the shore, living at Government House, which was right there, when you're standing at the Peace Museum and you're looking at the building that's up on the ridge there, which was the second settlement surgeons' quarters, that's on exactly the same piece of land that Philip Ridley Kidd's Government House was. So he's actually has a prime view on the verge of that hill to this unfolding disaster. He writes, and surely belying what he would have felt, his journal records the events with little emotion. He says, "At noon, the Sirius, having twice missed stays and being embayed, struck on the outer part of the reef. King would return to Sydney Cove on the Supply to deliver the news to Governor Arthur Phillip. Luckily, there had been no loss of life from the wrecking. However, the Sirius had been the main means of contact with the outside world for both settlements. Without her, they must have felt hopelessly lost and marooned on an alien shore, far from the old world and home. Governor Phillip, when word came back to him, wrote, 'You never saw such dismay as the news of the wreck occasioned amongst us all, for, to use a sea term, we looked upon her as our sheet anchor.' He immediately had to issue orders to further reduce the half rations that the Sydney population was existing on. On Norfolk Island, the effects were felt immediately, with an overnight doubling of the population. Food and other supplies were now seriously short, and starvation was a real possibility. And as Helen's taken us through, within a week, martial law was enforced. This is my lovely Lieutenant Ralph Clark of the Royal Marines, having been on board the Sirius for the journey and having been put ashore. And you may know, of course, that Clark Island in Sydney is named after him, where he had a vegetable garden in 1789. Clark's diary expresses his fears. He says, "Gracious God, what will become of us all? The whole of our provisions in the ship now wreck before us. I hope in God that we will be able to save some, if not all. But why do I float ashore?" This painting by Bradley shows the method that they used to rescue the crew. They floated a rope ashore, which was fastened to a barrel, and it floated ashore. They then fastened the rope to a pine tree, and it allowed the men to sort of use it like a hawser and scrambled ashore. Nable tells us of the stranding, that the heavy surf rolling aboard of us still drove her further in, but before the swell broke, we got a boat alongside and sent Captain Cook's timepiece and 2 women, one being pregnant, on shore. So you have this precious item that's on board, the K1 timekeeper, manufactured in 1769 by Larkin Kendall after Harrison's H4 for £500. It was taken by Cook, of course, on his second voyage and described as our faithful guide through all the vicissitudes of climates. Issued to Phillip for use on the Sirius and described as by Bradley, Captain Phillip, who with Captain Hunter or Mr. Dawes were always to be present at the winding of it at noon. And it, of course, is the first thing rescued from the wreck, even before that poor pregnant musician's wife. Following its successful removal, abandoning the ship continued. Clark records again, I was very nearly drowned yesterday when I was going off on a raft to assist the people that were coming on shore. Almost drowned by one of the convicts who could not swim. Fell off the raft and pushed me along with him, in which case we would both have drowned if I could not have swimmed. When I got on shore he was almost dead, but he soon recovered, on which I took a stick out of one of the sergeant's hands and gave him a damn thrashing for pulling me off the raft with him. He better have drowned, for I will give him the same every day for this month to come that I meet him. Poor fellow's just survived the wrecking and drowning of him. He's thrashed. When night fell, there was still crew left on board who had a nervous time not knowing if the ship would break up during the night, potentially leading to their deaths. At daybreak, they began the rescue again until everyone was eventually able to come to shore. However, everyone is now on land looking out at the ship that contains their precious supplies and foodstuffs. So on the 22nd of March, the sea had moderated a little. Now, could please the descendant of a Mr. William Dring put up your hand if you're in the audience? Stay up the back there. Keep your eye on this lady because have a listen to what her ancestor got up to. 2 convicts, William Dring and James Branahan, volunteered to swim to the wreck and liberate the livestock. That was swimmers, which was probably unusual in those days. Most of the animals swam rapidly to shore. Unfortunately, her ancestor and Mr. Brannigan discovered the ship's supply of grog and was soon gloriously drunk. Being a little cold, they thought the fire might warm them. They set the Sirius alight in 2 places before and it began to burn before it could be extinguished. The fire burnt through the gun deck. So others had to come out and put that fire out. Dring and Brannigan were punished by being sent to Nepean Island for a few weeks with, of course, next to no rations. It's amazing they weren't actually hung. To put those precious foodstuffs in danger was quite an amazing thing. Ralph Clark's chest, which had been thrown overboard at the time of the shipwreck, made it ashore with the bottom fallen out. HMS Sirius 3rd Lieutenant Henry Waterhouse was kind to him though. On hearing that he lost nearly everything, Waterhouse offered him 6 shirts, which Clark actually refused to accept as he felt he would not be able to repay him. Waterhouse did, however, take letters on his behalf for Sydney and England. He returned on the supply voyage that went back to Sydney. Some of Clark's clothing was eventually found, including his best coat and 1 shirt, which was found lying on the reef 5 days after the wreck. And Clark wrote about this Friday 26th of March 1790. Everybody employed as yesterday. One of the seamen in coming on shore from the ship today, Mr. Walker, the captain's clerk, seeing him with a white shirt on over all his other clothes, which proved to be one of mine, which I took to believe they must have broken my trunk open and taken all of my things out and then thrown my trunk with the bottom empty. My small trunk came also today on shore without anything in it. I owe that I never shall be able to get the quarter of my things. In short, I now give them up for lost. I represented to the sailor having my shirt to Major Ross. Because you can imagine these guys now, they're stranded here with absolutely nothing. You don't even have a change of clothes. And they're here for nearly a year before they're able to get off the island. In the following weeks, it was decided to strip the ship of the hardware so desperately needed on the island. Sails, horses, masts and spars, fittings and the timber of the ship itself were removed until she was down to the waterline. It took nearly 2 years to actually do all that, finishing with 15 cannons being removed in 1792. Before long, all trace of the Sirius disappeared from view. Starvation, as Helen's already told us about, was averted by the taking of over 200,000 migratory birds nesting on Mount Pitt over the following 4 months. Clark records actually the daily total of the birds taken in his diary, sufficient number of which resulted in their extinction on Norfolk Island and the christening of them as the Providence petrel. A new breeding pairs have actually returned just in more recent modern times, possibly blown off course from New Zealand or from Lord Howe Island, so we have the Providence petrel back again. There is a thought that a causeway that you can see here at low tide, at extreme low tides, you can see it, was used to get the heavy items ashore. I'm a little suspect of that because it's actually not documented, and as we know, everything was documented. And there have been other shipwrecks, and the Ranaki was wrecked here in World War II. There's been other wrecks and other reasons for causeways and things to be built. So I'm a little bit suspicious of that actually being from the wreck of the Sirius. Midshipman on the Sirius, George Raper, evocatively captures what must have been the pervasive mood of the settlement in the title of this painting of the wreck as "The Melancholy Loss of HMS Sirius, wrecked on the reef at Sydney Bay, Norfolk Island, 19th of March, 1790. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I seriously think that they're on Mars and their spaceship has blown up. You know? Getting back to Sydney is impossible. Getting back to Mother England, my God, that's gone. This quick graphic just shows you a modern reconstruction of the movement of the Sirius after the stranding. This was part of the work that Graham and Myra came up with, and that was based on contemporary accounts and their illustrations as well as that archaeological evidence that they found. Position B represents the position of the ship after the masts were cut and some heavy equipment jettisoned. The ship lay broadside to the reef, which allowed the longboats to come alongside and do some unloading, so they were able to get people luckily off while it was in position B. But in the evening, with the rising tide, she swung on her anchor chain so that the bow was now pointed out to sea. But by the 28th of March, the ship was again broadside and had been thrown higher onto the reef so that some ballast and some old anchor and an old anchor spilled out. Position E shows the lighter hull was again thrown onto the reef. So the lighter the ship got as they removed more items, the more she came up onto the reef. Position F is the salvage continued and as the hull became lighter, it's thrown closer to the shore beyond the outer reef. By March 29th, the rising tide had turned the hull so that the bow faced the shore. This was the point when the ship began to break up. The ballast fell through the hull. The wreck remained on the reef for almost 2 years until it had finally broken up during the storm in January 1792. And, you know, I really, really feel for those people because not only do they have to live, you know, with the half rations, with the knowledge that their saviour ship that was heading off to China to get those foodstuff and supplies that they desperately needed has gone, but they've got the visual reminder of it sitting right there for 2 years to come. This painting by George Raper is titled The Chief Settlement of Norfolk Island, April 1790. So he's actually pretty quickly painted this after the wrecking event and his coming ashore. It's such a peaceful image that I think it kind of really belies the mood, pervasive mood that must have been there at the time. Just here, that's actually you can see when you come closer up, that's actually a longboat that's sort of poking out from a shed, which perhaps was one of the longboats from the Sirius. That flag, people say to us, oh, what was the Swedish flag? I think it was doing there. That's actually a naval flag, apparently, which would have meant safe anchorage to come ashore, which was the flag that would have been flying for them when they actually began, first pulled up to actually begin the unloading of the supplies before the wreck occurred, which is possibly why he's given it such prominence there. I mean, it's obviously out of perspective, but you can see a lot of really good detail in this image. That first settlement is essentially a lot of timber buildings that are hugging that point. The Flagstaff Hill that heads up behind it. You can see the timber that's on the right-hand side there, almost like American log buildings, style buildings they used to built to begin with. And the building, of course, that's at the top of the hill that takes centre stage there is Government House. And that actually gives you, just as an aside, gives you a little bit of a difference in the clue of the purpose of the settlement, because Government House there was built facing directly onto the landing place. So the importance for Philip Gidley King as the commandant to actually witness and see the unloading and actually take control of the activities of the settlement through the house being positioned focused on the landing place. In the second settlement, all the buildings, the main building that you actually see is the wall of the jail compound, and the buildings are actually oriented slightly, tilted about 30 degrees further over, because the orientation of that settlement is all about crime and punishment. So when you arrive by sea, what you see is a great big long jail wall, and you see buildings that are all around that purpose of keeping you incarcerated. Just finishing off with my friend Ralph Clark. This is a lovely image that's later painted by John Eyre, who Clark's was appointed the Quartermaster General and Keeper of the Public Stores by Robert Ross a few days after the wrecking of the Sirius, and in that capacity he supervised the clearing of the ground and the laying out of Charlotte's Field, or Queenborough as it was called, during April and May 1791. So they found, as Helen told us at the beginning of her presentation, an area in the middle of the island, which is basically when your plane takes off, it's the northern tip of the runway, that gully that goes down into there, and they found that it was less sparsely timbered, so they thought that there was potential that it had actually served as being fields and had been cleared, potentially used by the Polynesians, and there were a lot of artefacts that were found there too. But because it was less sparsely timbered, they were able to get the crops in the ground quickly, because of course that immediate urgency to clear more ground, get more crops in and sown was on. Just for Ralph Clark, he on Norfolk Island, he actually formed a relationship with First Fleet convict Mary Branham, and it was on Norfolk Island that Mary gave birth to Anne Clark, and he returned to Sydney in 1791, taking Mary and two of her other children that she already had, William and Anne. So, in closing for you now, I'm just going to reiterate my passion for ensuring that the importance and the stories of HMS Sirius are recognised and understood, both in terms of the display and care of her artefacts, right here on Norfolk Island in the Sirius Museum, the story of the expeditions to bring her remains to the surface, and how that work helped to retell the narrative of the preparedness of the First Fleet for its mission. Today we can also remember the Sirius, remember the hardy souls of the First Fleet, and in particular those who arrived here on the Sirius's last voyage and witnessed her tragic wrecking. So thank you. I don't know if you're all worn out of presentations and airing things now, but if there's any questions, happy to answer.
Yeah, we've finished that part, and it's a nice sunny day now. Going to go up and see the park up the road.